Welcome to the 2 for 20 podcast. It's just two guys for 20 minutes on faith, family, and figuring it out. Here are your hosts, Lewis and Jim.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the 2 for 20 podcast, and I'm Lewis, and he's Jim. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing really great. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well as well. Tonight, I thought that maybe we can talk a little bit about chastity. I know it's not an easy subject to take on, but you know, I was hoping that we could talk about it and try to figure out. Number one, we can define what chastity is. Number two, maybe discuss some ways that we could talk to the youth about, how to remain chaste, and especially as as fathers, I'm sure we're going to come across situations as our kids get older, where these questions are going to come up, and I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit today, and what advice you would give me and other fathers out there, and mothers that may encounter this question or this situation at one point, where we have a child or teenager, or coming up to them and asking them questions about, why should I not have sex? Just remain chaste, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say this. My first thought that comes to mind is that the topic of chastity, especially when dealing with like my own kids, my oldest is 12, and he would be horribly embarrassed to know that his dad's deciding to have a podcast talking about chastity and a 12-year-old boy. So I guess my experience as a dad would be something of like, and I don't think it's that uncommon. It might be the most terrifying subject to talk to your kids about. Because it's such a deeply personal and taboo subject as far as the culture is concerned, as far as like talking honestly about it. And so I think the immediate reaction for most parents, and myself included, is like an immediate sense of anxiety and nervousness. Like, this is going to be awkward. This is going to be weird. I mean, I'm thinking back to my own childhood and thinking like, I don't really remember any meaningful conversations with my dad or my mom about the idea of chastity, or, meaningful, thoughtful kind of like, okay, here's where the best way to live. Here's how you kind of have a well integrated, healthy sexuality. Like, those are not normal conversations. I mean, I don't know what your experience was growing up, but that certainly was not my experience growing up with my parents.
Yeah. No, you know what it reminds me of? Like, it's like these parents who are always saying, well, you can't teach my kid about sex education, which I respect, right? That's my job, and then the kid comes home and he says, well, where did I come from? And they'll say, the stork brought you home, So it's like, we have to be informed, right? We have to be willing to have the conversation and have an honest conversation about it, right? Like you, it was taboo in my house to speak about these things, and I I guess you eventually figure it out, but
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right way, right?
No, I agree. I think so. I remember talking with some friends about this not too long ago, maybe over the summer. And one of the things we were discussing is, how much detail do you give your kid? For instance, like, I think there's a difference between discussing the biology of sex and human sexuality, and then the theology of sex and sexuality, right? And, how much specifics do you give, right? And I think that there's appropriate terms to use at appropriate ages. And I think you're right. Like, if I'm talking with my 12-year-old son and he asks some questions like, where do babies come from? And I say something like, there's a stork that flies through, like, and he's like, what are you talking about? Like,
Yeah.
I've got an 8-month-old baby at home. So he looks at his baby sister and he's kind of like, yeah, mom was pregnant. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is weird. So I think giving like this super cheesy, like Disney movie answer to a kid who's in that middle school range is really just not appropriate. But on the flip side of it, kind of giving like really nitty gritty, intimate details is also maybe not. So there's this weird balancing act of like, well, how much is appropriate and how much is maybe not appropriate or not necessary. And I think that's a really difficult spot. And I think that's probably why, I know for me, it's a place that can be nerve wracking. And I'm sure for a lot of parents, it's a place of like, I don't even know where to go. So I'm going to avoid that conversation and hope they figure this out in a way that's not destructive, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And it's tough, because they're gonna hear it at school, they're gonna hear it out in the world, and you know you're not sure what they're gonna hear one thing from their friends, they may hear something else from their teachers during sex education if they go to public school or whatever. And you know you wonder, right? But I feel that fear sometimes. I don't know how much information is too much information, right? How much detail to give, right? um so it's weird. We have to figure this out though, because we have to have that conversation, right? And I think it really depends on the child, and what level of maturity um they possess. And I can tell you, I have two boys, and both are very intelligent, amazing kids, but very different personalities. And I know what I can tell one and what I can tell the other, and um how I would approach that with them, at least when I
Yeah.
maybe not exactly, but yeah. So I think it depends on the child, and I think that it's good to have the conversation too. And one thing I want to say, um, I don't think that, yeah, you should prepare yourself for the conversation, but don't be afraid to have the conversation if you don't have all the information. I think it's important to initiate some type of communication with your child about this, to teach them, and if you don't know it, or if you're like not sure how to explain it, you can say, hey, you know what, I don't know this. Let's look it up on the internet, or
Be
obviously
careful
go
with
to
the
good.
internet.
Huh? What's that?
I said, be careful with the internet.
Yeah, as soon as I said it, I said, I was gonna say, well, make sure you go to reputable sites,
Yeah.
and that they're not, and that's why it's so difficult, because we're
Yeah.
competing with all these worldly sources and
Yeah.
things that are coming in and teaching something that it's not,
Yeah. I
but we
think,
don't feel it's correct.
yeah, no, I think so. A couple of thoughts. So number one, I think, I agree. Conversations need to be had, and I think that the conversation needs to not be the sex talk, the
Right.
one time only. I'm going to take you for a drive. We're going to sit on a park bench overlooking the ocean, and I'm going to explain to you the birds and the bees, or some kind of whatever thing. The idea that like it's a one time only conversation, I think is severely lacking. I think it's a ongoing conversation. And I think that the depth of the conversation, of course, matters according to the maturity of the kid. But one of the reasons why I think it's important to keep it as an ongoing conversation is because exactly what you just said, they're going to have someone in their school, someone on their baseball team, somebody in their kind of neighborhood group of friends that's going to have, one of these phones in their pocket that their mom bought them,
Yeah.
the newest iPhone, and they're going to be at the playground, and you're like, hey, yeah, go ahead. You can ride bikes and go play football at the park with your buddies. And one of their buddies pulls out a device, and next thing you know, they're browsing for whatever the most horrible, disgusting things you could find online are. And that's certainly not the way that we want, our children to try to learn about sex, because that's not truly sex. That's a distortion. That's it's a horrible corruption of a good. So that would say number one is like, be the person who starts the conversation. And sadly, like I've heard some of the statistics on this, and it's very troubling that I think the average age in the United States of exposure to pornography for children is something like 10 years old now, which is just like mind-blowing. You think 10-year-old children, those are babies, 10-year-old kids on average, not every kid, but on average in the United States will have their first exposure to pornography. Some younger, of course, some older. But that's a really troubling thing to consider because, a lot of adults might not have had exposure to pornography until they were, later in high school or college or whatever, or maybe some had it younger, maybe whatever. but that's really troubling because the internet provides this kind of X-rated movie, high definition theater in our pockets that we can pull out and search for the most disgusting things ever. So we certainly don't want kids to kind of learn this distorted image. So I think the conversation needs to take place even at a younger age, but finding that place of what's appropriate and what's not is not easy. I would say this, here's my like 2 cents of what I think is valuable and maybe what I found useful in my own self, and kind of hearing different other speakers or commentators talk about this. I would say this, put a hyper stress when talking about sex and sexuality on the goodness of God and the goodness of creation and the goodness of our human bodies, that there's nothing evil about sex or sexuality. In fact, it's not that it's just good, it's sacred. And things that are sacred should be treated as sacred things. And the image that I've kind of given over the years, I remember, is like, we would be absolutely disgusted and appalled if we were ever in church, let's say, before Mass, and imagine somebody were just to kind of walk up, go behind the altar, go to the tabernacle, open the tabernacle up, pull out like the most blessed sacrament, and just start tossing it around the church like a frisbee or something. Like, we would just be absolutely appalled at the sacrilege, the evil, the taking of the most sacred body and blood of Christ and desecrating it, right? I think not in the same manner, but in a similar manner, the way that human sexuality and the sacredness of sex, particularly within the context of what ought to be in the context of marriage, is kind of perverted in our culture into this, objectification of mostly women, but men too, but mostly women, is such an evil. And so I think focusing on, like, God made things good. God made men good. God made women good. God made the relationship between men and women good. God made this unity of marriage and healthy sexual activity as a good thing and a sacred thing. And when done in the right context, in the right manner, is a holy thing. It's an occasion for grace, which sounds crazy to talk about, that like the marital embrace of a husband and wife is actually such a holy thing that it's an occasion for grace. It's an occasion for receiving God's life, which there's not many people who talk about, like, oh yeah, like my wife and I, we had grace last night. You're like, what? Like, that would be a really funny way to talk about that among friends, I guess. But but I would say kind of a hyper stress on the goodness of it. And because it's so good and so it's so sacred, that to have anything less than that is like a sacrilege. And so whatever the culture throws out, whether it's advertising or like the filth that's available online and pornography, all of those things are taking the goodness and the beauty and the holiness and the sacredness of the sexual act that God gave to humanity for the purpose of marriage and family life, and just kind of completely just distorted it and turned it into garbage. And so I would say maybe there's a place an angle to play.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that's a very good approach. I think the key also is sometimes we hold off a little bit and we say, well, it's not the right time to talk to our children about that because maybe they're not the right age, right? But like you said earlier, I think that if we approach this from the perspective of setting the foundation in our faith, right? And we think about what chastity is, and in a very basic term, we say, chastity is purity, right? And a child, as young as 7, 8, you can already start to introduce those concepts. You may not go into details about other things, but and I think it's important that we start early talking about these things, right? We know that we said chastity is a form of purity, right? We know it's one of the 7 virtues. We can start talking about that, right? So that when the issue becomes greater, and more questions come up, that child would have already had that foundation. And this is what we believe. This is our faith. This is what our Catholic faith teaches us. And for the reasons you already mentioned, right? Because you should save yourself. You should, the act of having sex with your wife is something that's sacred, and a gift. It truly is a gift, So, and, for those reasons, you should, um, take care of your body, protect your body, all those things, so it's not distorted or taken advantage of, so yeah, I agree with everything you said, and and that would be the only thing I would add to it, that not to be afraid to have the conversation, with a younger child, but with the right, appropriateness, right, where you're saying, defining terms, to set that foundation.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Do
very
you think like there's a part of me that wonders and has a certain kind of like sadness for our kids growing up, because I know for me growing up, you know, the things like, pornographic images were around. My dad had a lot of that garbage around, and it was something that like I can remember getting exposed to it when I was probably in that middle school range and into high school. But the internet wasn't like a thing until like, late high school, college years, right? But for these kids, this exposure is so rampant, and more than just the exposure, the cultural acceptance of it, I think, is more troubling.
yeah.
The idea that like, it was still very much taboo, I think, growing up. Like generally speaking, uh, if somebody were accused of looking at pornography, I can remember being a kid, like if somebody accused somebody of looking at pornography, people would be like, no, 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 that stuff's gross. No, no, no. And people would deny it because of the social shame of like, if you look at now, it's like applauded and talked about in like mainstream, everything of like, yeah, whatever, no big deal. Like it's so commonplace and celebrated.
I remember watching soap operas where, the actors would kiss and my mother covering my eyes,
Yeah.
So I wouldn't watch that. But you're right. In the old days, a kid was caught looking at a nudie magazine and it was this big deal. You would have, the parents come in, there would be meetings. And if a neighbor, they would talk and like try to tell the kid, to show the kid that, this wasn't appropriate, or, and now it's like, it's, the biggest is not, the internet. Yes, it's a huge danger. It makes it readily available to them. But I think the biggest danger is how it's kind of socially accepted now, and it's, and under the pretense that, oh, he's just curious or she's just curious. They're inquiring about their bodies. They're going through changes and this and that, and no thought is given to, what dangers, these websites or whatever, pose, so you're right. It's very sad, but again, this is why we can't let our guard down, as Catholic fathers. We have to be strong and understand, and call it for what it is. The internet is just another tool that the devil uses to bring, the family down. Think about it. If a child early on thinks that, having sex is something normal because my body says that I need this, um, you know, and he or she begins to have sex at an early age, what does that do for their relationships later on? What value are they placing on, what connections they can have with other people if, the very act of having a sexual relation is, something that is just kind of like this casual thing, and you know what I mean? And so I agree, it's very sad what's happening.
And I think something that, there's one way to talk about the issue of like the lack of chastity. And chastity as a virtue just means having a healthy, integrated sense of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman made in the image and likeness of God, right? So having a healthy sense of saying, I'm a man, that's a woman, this is our reality made in the image and likeness of God. And we're all made with this shared equal dignity in the eyes of our creator, right? So having a healthy sense of well-integrated sexuality, like that's lacking so much. And there's such a collective view that the other person is only as good as much as they can provide some sort of sexual pleasure for me. And St. John Paul II, I remember reading somewhere, had this great reference or line. He said something like the opposite of love, because we're all made for love and desire love. The opposite of love is not hate, right? The opposite of love is not hate, but the opposite of love is use, right? To look at another person and to use them as an object, to treat them as not even human, but you're just as good as whatever it is that I want to take from you. That instead of me giving my life to you as an act of love and desiring and sacrifice, I just want to take from you. I just want to get from you some sort of, in regards to the sexual morality, some sort of sexual pleasure. So you're only as good as beautiful as you look to me. You're only as good as much as you stimulate certain parts of my body. And that's a really awful way to kind of carry on in this world. It's a really dangerous and self-destructive way. And so I think speaking about this stuff from a religious theological perspective, of course, it has grave implications on the life of our relationship with God. But there's even, and you hinted at this, right? Like practical dangers to unhealthy sexual lifestyles, if you will, kind of the lack of the virtue of chastity, and that like when people engage in sex before marriage, have a higher rate of depression, have a higher rate of suicide, have a higher rate of mental health problems.
Right.
People who have sex before marriage and cohabitate before marriage statistically have a much higher rate of divorce after being married. These are like really like data-driven things. These aren't like things that it's like, oh, in the Bible it says, or the Pope says. Like this is sociological data, and so that should give people some pause to say, like, it seems like if I really want to live a healthy and happy life, that perhaps I should give honest consideration to living the virtue of chastity and looking at other people not as objects for my personal sexual satisfaction, but rather as other human beings made in God's image and likeness. I was just looking up on my phone because I heard something about this survey, which I found fascinating. I've been looking at it all day for different things. And it's a survey from a website called thestateoftheology.com, right? So I'm going to just read this. This is a question that was a survey that was asked among Catholics in the United States in the year 2020. So Catholics in America, I don't know how big their sample size was, but the statement was, sex outside of traditional marriage is a sin. And so people would say either they agree or strongly agree, somewhat agree, not sure, somewhat disagree, or strongly disagree. So this was fascinating to me. Sex outside of traditional marriage is a sin. 22% of Catholics in the United States strongly disagree with that statement, right? Like that is a sad reality, I think, to say that there's 22% of American Catholics who disagree, strongly disagree that sex outside of marriage is a sin. Yeah, so I think this survey is interesting because it's kind of startling to hear just how many Catholics would say that that sex outside of traditional marriage is not a sin, and I think that's kind of a sadness that within our church, within our own community, there's far too many people who don't understand the gravity of this act and kind of take the sacredness of the sexual activities and sexual relationship between husband and wife as a kind of throwaway option, I suppose. And so it's a bit of a sadness, but maybe just to kind of wrap up, the last kind of little bit I would have in regards to kind of talking with your kids and kind of having that conversation outside of the things we've already said would be just a quick practical tip. I know for our family and our devices, whether it's our phones or our computers, it's one thing to have filtering and internet blocking software as best you can. As far as from what I know, the best, we're not sponsored by them, but if they want to sponsor us, that'd be great. Covenant Eyes is a wonderful program.
Yes.
And it's a relatively cheap, I think you're paying like maybe $10 a month for a subscription, and you can add as many devices as you like. But the great thing about it is that not only does it block material and inappropriate things on whatever device you want to add it to, and there's no way to get around it, it's kind of built right into the computer itself. But it provides accountability. So if my son wanted to look up something, or if even I wanted to look up something, my wife would get an email notification saying, this device at this time, somebody searched for something inappropriate. And I think that provides a little bit of comfort and security to know that there's kind of a guardianship over what is out there.
Yeah, so I think that's, Covenant Eyes, that sounds like a great software. And every family, not just Catholic families, should have something like that on their devices, to have some type of accountability, and, because there's real danger out there, So yeah, if you have any comments or anything you want to add to this conversation to the listeners at home, please feel free to drop us a comment. If you're listening to us via the YouTube channel, you can also email us. We'd love to hear from you. I think that's all I have for today, Jim. So
yeah, this is good. I'm glad you brought this up. It's an awkward conversation, but one worth having.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then I guess we'll say goodnight to everyone, and if you like what you're listening to, please subscribe, hit that little bell so you get notified of the podcast, and
what do the kids say? You got to smash that like button, or is that what they say? I don't know.
Something like, I think we have to be a lot cooler,
I don't know. We were just saying this beforehand, that we're a couple of old guys now. We're not like the kids.
Yeah, when did we turn into our fathers? I mean, this is
give
weird,
us the
right?
thumbs up sign, everybody.
Yeah, whatever that is, right? What are you calling it these days?
Radio? Is this a radio thing we're doing? I don't understand this. Oh, God have mercy on us all. All right,
give
everybody.
us a like. My thumb hurts now from doing that.
Yeah. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time. God bless.
Good night, everyone. God bless.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, make sure to share with a friend. See you next time. Bye. God bless.